BYU Center for Family History and Genealogy, which sponsors student research for the Nauvoo Community Project. And if you haven't been to the Nauvoo Community Project, you need to go there. An extension of Jill's thesis research on Garden Grove, Iowa, the Nauvoo Project continues to provide new information about the early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who lived in Iowa in 1846 to 52. And she is a wonderful lady and knows a whole lot. I've worked with her for a number of years. Mary Ann's professional background, Mary Ann Kirk's professional background comes from her managing the Arts and History Department in Murray City, Utah for 25 years, where she wore many hats. She even designed their museum. After retirement, she served an 18-month mission at San Diego Mormon Battalion Center with her husband, where they learned the history of their ancestors in the battalion. She is one of a small handful of researchers for the Mormon Battalion Association, making sure the right man was identified for each of our men in the battalion. These two women often work together in trying to document who our early pioneers are. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Jill.
We've had a lot said about Garden Grove the last couple of days, and I guess I get the last word, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, during the fall and winter of 1845, the entire city of Nauvoo, Illinois, became a production workshop for all of the supplies necessary for 15,000 Mormons to leave their city. In September, Brigham Young and other leaders of the church had made an agreement with the local authorities that the saints would leave the following spring. Months were spent in preparation for the impending departure, yet when the time came, many still had insufficient food, clothing, and shelter to survive on the isolated plains of America. Brigham Young had a formidable task ahead. He was to lead this people away from civilization to an unknown destination, ill-prepared and poverty-stricken. His solution had many facets, but the establishment of way stations across Iowa became crucial to the economic survival of his people. On the 4th of February, 1846, the first of the saints began crossing the Mississippi River into Iowa. Although a few of the men left under threat of arrest, hundreds of families left in February and made their way to the Sugar Creek camp in Iowa because they didn't want to be left behind, regardless of their state of preparation. It was recorded that while Brigham Young was at Sugar Creek, 800 men reported themselves in camp without a fortnight's provisions. Because these families did not have the food and supplies they needed, they became a burden to the leadership, and those few who did have a sufficient outfit. While attempting to obtain wagons, cattle, food, and clothing for their departure, most of the Mormons needed to sell their homes and property in order to make the necessary purchases. Unfortunately, everyone surrounding Nauvoo knew that the Mormons were leaving, and they knew that they could claim the homes and land at no cost once the city was abandoned. Lewis Dunbar Wilson wrote, "We have belonged to the church at this time about 11 years, have passed through the Missouri Wars of 1838, and from that we went to Illinois and stood the brunt of the hard times at Nauvoo from its rise to its downfall, left Nauvoo with the first camp and came to Garden Grove, and there was left without one day's provisions ahead." Mormon historians frequently emphasize the fact that the way stations were created so that the poor who were still in Nauvoo could come partway and continue their preparations, but the most immediate purpose was to help those who were already on site and could not go on. On the 12th of April, 1846, after enduring nearly incessant wind and rainstorms for the 2 previous months, Brigham Young called a council meeting to discuss the condition of their people. There had been virtually no feed for the teams for almost a week, and hundreds of the pioneers had exhausted what little food and supplies they were able to bring with them. The council decided to establish a permanent farm on the Grand River where cabins could be built and many could remain until they were better prepared for the long trek to the Rocky Mountains. This settlement would provide a way for those who were unprepared to continue working toward the necessary fit-out. Remembering his arrival at the farm, Howard Egan wrote, "The next place I think was Garden Grove, a most beautiful place. The wagons were all placed in a row side by side with room to pass between them. There was a bowery built along the front, and the tongue of each wagon was tied to it, thus making the long, shady lane. I went with some other boys with some men that were getting brush for the top of the bowery, and when we got to the grove that was on the lower ground, I thought it was the prettiest place I had ever seen." Nelson Whipple wrote, "When we arrived at this place, it was one continuous bed of onions as far as the eye could extend in all directions in the tall oak timber that stood so thick on the ground without underbrush. On account of the vast amount of onions, the place was called Garden Grove. This was the first of many settlements established by the Saints while crossing Iowa in 1846. When Brigham Young left Garden Grove in May, approximately 600 of the Saints were left behind at the new settlement. Those who remained were the sick, aged, injured, destitute, widows, pregnant women with their families, and enough healthy families to help care for them and keep the way station functioning. Economically, the settlers of Garden Grove were the Saints who were the least prepared and had little to sustain themselves. While moving the camp of Israel westward across Iowa, Brigham Young continued to receive reports on the situation in Nauvoo. 2 weeks before he learned of the Nauvoo battle, a rescue party was organized from winter quarters. After hearing about the battle and the Saints who were exiled across the Mississippi River, leaders organized a second rescue party from Council Bluffs. A third and lesser-known rescue party was organized in Garden Grove, which was led by Luman Shurtleff. Previous historians have supposed that the poor camp was emptied out with the first two rescues, and Andrew Jensen wrote that on the 9th October, the Camp of the Poor was organized and started for the west. All who wished to move westward had the opportunity offered them, and they were brought on to the main camp by the teams which had been sent back," close quote. Jensen was referring only to the first rescue group, and it is now known that not everyone was able to travel with that company. Luman Shurtleff indicated that there were still exiles who needed assistance beyond even the capacity of the second company. He described the overall rescue effort. "I went to the river opposite Nauvoo to hunt up and prepare as many of the poor as the teams could take back to the grove. I found many sick that were very destitute. Other teams that were first there had taken those who were able to travel and had provisions and left those who were sick and destitute. I thought my teams could carry about 60 persons, whom I had not provisions enough to last the company 3 days, and how this company were to travel 170 miles without food was more than I could tell. I had but 75 cents to buy it with, but I intended to start with them and in the Lord trust." Everyone in the poor camp struggled with exposure and poverty, but the people remaining when Shurtleff arrived were the poorest of them all. Approximately 60 of these people were brought to Garden Grove in 8 or 9 wagons to be cared for among the poorest and least prepared who had first been left there from the Exodus in February. It is difficult to express the extent of the poverty that existed in Garden Grove that first winter. In addition to the families who had been economically devastated by the loss of their property in Nauvoo, 15 widows were brought to the way station without a husband to help them build, plant, and care for a total of 30 children. Nelson Whipple wrote, "Many poor and many widows that could not earn a cent toward a living and had to be supported by the 1/10 or 1/5 of what was brought into the settlement by those that went and worked for it. There were 15 widows and their families that had to be fed in this way, and their wood furnished them through the winter. Thus the reader may see that we had enough to do." And I think that's an understatement. The burdens on the men in Garden Grove were great. Not only were they trying to care for their own families and the widows and fatherless children, but 13 of the men were polygamous. Caring for their own families meant that those 13 men were already caring for a total of 32 women and their children. In November 1846, after he returned from the poor camp rescue, Luman Shurtleff wrote, "I went to work and gathered my little crop. Many families had little or no provision, others a scant supply. And when we took it into consideration, we found that there was not provision or clothing enough to support the inhabitants of the grove." The settlers of Garden Grove knew that they did not have enough food to last that first winter. It is not difficult to understand the desperation they must have felt. In spite of being condemned for their crimes, a few began to feel justified in thievery and counterfeiting because of all they had suffered. Others had stolen their property, and some were willing to steal in return. Nelson Whipple wrote, "Brother John Bear came to me and seemed to have some secrecy to reveal to me. And we went into the woods and sat upon a log when he said to me, 'Don't you think you could make dies for making $half and quarters?' I told him it was a job I had never undertook and knew but very little about it. I asked him what he wanted to do with them. He said he could make money that could pass in Missouri just as well as any. He told me of several ways that it might be done, and that he thought I was quite an ingenious man and could make them as well as not. But I told him I was quite busy and could not attend to it." Although there is no doubt that there were thieves and counterfeiters in Garden Grove, the records also demonstrate that these practices were not tolerated. When discovered, thieves were required to return stolen goods, and punishments were administered. Counterfeiters were excommunicated from the church. All the theft and counterfeiting issues seem to have come to a head in 1847. On 18 July, the entire Garden Grove branch was excommunicated from the church. The next day, Orson Hyde wrote a letter to the branch informing them of this action and assured the innocent that everything would be sorted out. Upon receiving Hyde's letter, the Garden Grove branch presidency traveled immediately to winter quarters to explain the conditions of the branch. The High Council had acted because they believed the problems were more widespread than they were, and they believed the guilty members were not being punished. In fact, the Garden Grove branch presidency held a council and excommunicated several members on the same day the High Council in winter quarters withdrew membership from the entire branch. David Fulmer gave an accurate report of their problems. The High Council declared that there had been misrepresentations made, and the branch was reinstated on the 4th of August. Upon their return to Garden Grove, the presidency continued to discipline guilty members of the church until they eventually rid the town of these problems. At a general conference held in the Nauvoo Temple on 6th of April, 1845, Brigham Young proposed a covenant that we take all the saints with us to the extent of our ability, that is, our influence and our property. The vote was unanimous, and he held the people to their covenant. As early as May 1846, Brigham Young stated that some of the saints were forgetting that they had covenanted to help the poor away at the sacrifice of all their property. The Nauvoo Covenant, as it was called, required that people with very little share what they had obtained with those who had even less. The Mormons' first defense against destitution and starvation was to bring together individual resources for the good of the entire group. Another resource available to the saints was church property. Shortly after the main company arrived in Garden Grove, Brigham Young and the other leaders of the church had to decide what to do with the Nauvoo Temple. Brigham Young recorded, "The council decided that the trustees might sell the temples at Nauvoo and Kirtland and all other property of the church and help the poor saints to move westward. The council considered that the temple would be of no benefit to the saints if they could not possess their private dwellings, and if the time should come that they should return and redeem their inheritances, they could redeem the temple also, that a sale would secure it from unjust claims, mobs, fire, and so forth, more effectually than for the church to retain it in their hands." 2 days later, the council's decision was unanimously approved at a meeting of the saints in Garden Grove, and the next day in Nauvoo, the temple was dedicated. The sacrifices made by the saints to build their temple were immense. When they could have been building more wagons, they continued to build a temple to their God. These circumstances make it all the more interesting that they decided to sell the temple even before it had been dedicated. In mid-May, Brigham Young and the main camp moved out of Garden Grove, but by the end of June, Captain James Allen of the U.S. Army arrived with instructions to enlist 4 or 5 companies from the Mormon camps to serve for 1 year in the war with Mexico. The Mormon leaders realized that if 500 of the strongest and healthiest men left the camp to serve in the Mormon battalion, there would not be sufficient manpower to cross the plains that year. They also knew that the soldiers' pay could help the people survive, and recruiting began immediately. A meeting was held in Council Bluffs, and Brigham Young traveled back to Mount Pisgah to encourage enlistment from that way station. From there, he also sent letters to Garden Grove and Nauvoo asking that all the single men and those that could be spared to come to Council Bluffs. Edward Bunker had settled in Garden Grove, and while working in Missouri for provisions, he heard a rumor that the saints had been asked to form a company to go to Mexico. He returned to the settlement and wrote in his journal, "Next day being Sunday, I went to meeting and heard the letter read. Volunteers were called for, and I was the first to offer my service. 8 others followed my example. They agreed to meet at my house the following Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, and we would start together for the Bluffs. Tuesday morning came, but none of the men who had agreed to meet me put in an appearance. So with my small bundle of clothes and provisions, I started alone, 140 miles, and only 1 settlement on the way." Bunker left behind his pregnant wife in the care of Nelson Whipple. Captain James Brown and Thomas Caron enlisted in the battalion from settlements further west, but their families remained in Garden Grove while they were away. As a result, even though Edward Bunker was the only man from Garden Grove known to respond to the call for the Mormon battalion, there were 3 battalion families in the way station: Emily Abbott Bunker and her baby, Abigail Smith Abbott Brown and her 7 children, and Anne Ratcliffe Caron and her 5 children. These women and children needed assistance in addition to the 15 widows mentioned previously. When the battalion reached Fort Leavenworth, their clothing allowance was paid in advance at the rate of $42 per soldier. Parley Pratt was able to return to Council Bluffs with $5,000 to $6,000 that was soon used to purchase wagon loads of provisions for the saints in that area. After the departure of the Mormon battalion, the remaining men continued seeking any work available to them, and whatever they earned was tithed for the poor. Unfortunately, the large number of the poor was overwhelming in Garden Grove, and the tithes were not sufficient to keep everyone fed. On the 25th of January, 1847, the leaders held a council and decided that their only hope of survival until a crop could be raised would be the generosity of strangers. Luman Shurtleff and Daniel Hunt were called on a begging mission, and on the 8th of February, they left Garden Grove and traveled toward the Mississippi River. They made their way to Nauvoo and Quincy. Next, they took a boat down the river to St. Louis, Missouri, where they met with the mayor. Shurtleff wrote, "We then divided the city, and Brother Hunt took a part and I the other, and went to each house, shop, tavern, store, and bank, told them our business, and asked them to do something for the poor Mormons. Sometimes I got curses, sometimes money or goods. I collected from $18 to $36 per day." When they had completed their work in St. Louis, Hunt returned to Garden Grove with the money and goods they had obtained, and Shurtleff moved on to Louisville, Kentucky, and then Cincinnati, Ohio. With time, Shurtleff's health began to suffer, and he finally decided that he needed to return home. On the 3rd of May, when he was only a few miles from home, he met Daniel Hunt and Erastus Derby, who were beginning a second begging mission to New Orleans. Shurtleff ended his account of this mission with the statement, "Thus the Lord provided for his people at Garden Grove." Shurtleff does not indicate the total value of what was donated, but one biographer estimated that the donations were worth $1,500. There is little doubt that these donations helped the people at Garden Grove to survive those last few months before they were able to bring in a crop. Although it's easy to blame the angry citizens of Illinois for placing the saints in their destitute circumstances, it was also the generosity of non-LDS people all across Iowa who gave the Mormons work and sold them provisions, the government officials who provided the opportunity of military wages for the Mormon battalion, and the non-LDS people in the cities of St. Louis, Louisville, Cincinnati, and New Orleans, who were generous in making donations to assist them. After harvesting their first crops in 1847, the saints were able to regain their health and return to their skills and professions. By summer, life in Garden Grove settled into that of a more typical frontier settlement. In previous studies of the Mormons in Garden Grove, historians have frequently stated that the LDS birth rate was much higher than the rest of the population. Dean L. May stated, in all its terms of birth, death, in-migration, and out-migration, the Mormons contrast rather sharply with the general population. Mormons are more fertile than most people around them, close quote. In 1850, the national crude birth rate per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44 was 194, and the crude birth rate per 1,000 population was 43.3. In Garden Grove, the birth rate in 1846 and 1850 was comparable to the national average, but these were unusual years because of extreme conditions during the trek across Iowa in 1846 and the cholera outbreak in 1850. The birth rate varied from year to year, with the largest variations in the data caused by distortions from small population numbers in 1851 and 52. Therefore, the average birth rate for 46 to 50 is a better measure for comparison purposes. However, even when comparing this average to the national average, the Garden Grove birth rate of 257 per 1,000 women was 32.5% higher. A comparison of national and Mormon birth rates in 1880 puts this statistic into perspective. At a time when polygamy was openly practiced, the Mormon birth rate was 198.9 births, and the national average was 155 births. These numbers in 1880 show that the LDS birth rate was 28.3% higher than the national average at that time. With a difference of 32.5% during the Iowa years, Garden Grove's birth rate was exceptionally high. This study has also revealed that all 6 women of childbearing age who remained in Garden Grove after the 1851 migration had either just given birth or bore a child within the next several months. Since all these families migrated in the spring of 1852, it's clear that they delayed their migration until the babies were born. Further research is needed to observe the timing of births relative to migration, but this study indicates that a significant number of families may have chosen to remain at the way station while awaiting the arrival of a child, thus greatly inflating the birth rates of the town. The mortality rate in Garden Grove has also been a matter of discussion for previous historians. Leland Gentry concluded, at least one problem was never conquered by the saints in Garden Grove, death. This ever-present specter struck the camp soon after the settlement was laid and never let up before the town was abandoned in 1852. According to the current study, this statement may not be correct. Based on the data that has been gathered to this point, there were 46 deaths in Garden Grove during the time the Mormons were there. Of those deaths, 46% occurred in the first year of settlement. However, since 4 of the 5 deaths in 1847 were known to have occurred in January, they were also likely to have been related to the exposure and malnutrition suffered during the exodus from Nauvoo. There was also a spike in the death rate during 1849 and 1850, which was related to the national cholera epidemic. 30% of the deaths in Garden Grove occurred in those 2 years. These calculations support the conclusion that the death rate did let up in 47 and 48, and so far the records do not indicate any deaths in 51 and 52. Although I will say I talked to Carla Gunzenhauser 2 days ago, and she has a death in 51 or 52 she wants me to check on. So there may have been one. The total number of deaths in the Garden Grove settlement is not very helpful without knowing whether those numbers are considered high or low. A crude mortality rate compares the number of deaths per thousand population. Dean L. May considered 20 deaths per thousand a high death rate, and only 3 of the years in this study exceeded that rate. Other than the extreme conditions of the first year of settlement and the cholera epidemic that affected the entire United States, these mortality statistics support the conclusion that Garden Grove was not an unhealthy place to live, contrary to what some earlier historians have implied based on less accurate information available prior to this study. I will also say there were snakes. There were rattlesnakes. Many of the journals talk about the snakes, but what they also talk about is that they bit the animals, not the people. And I found that very interesting. I didn't find any deaths caused by rattlesnakes, even though they were infested with rattlesnakes. So, interesting. Over time, the families of Garden Grove worked toward their objective of joining with the saints in the West. Poverty, hunger, and illness were common problems as the exiles arrived, and without the ability to recover and obtain supplies, they would not have been able to survive the trek to Utah. 21 people died that first year, but the Garden Grove Way Station was successful in assisting 609 settlers to complete their migration. Birth rates were high, even beyond that of typical Mormon populations. And finally, although the mortality rate was high for 3 years of the settlement period, it was not consistently high. There were several years where death was not a significant challenge. The saints overcame the desperate conditions of 1846 and 47, and the way station became a place of contentment as neighbors worked together toward a common goal. Margaret Zimmerman Brown said, "I think the happiest period of my life was the 5 years we spent in Garden Grove." She had a different opinion than Ezra Benson. Every year as springtime arrived, more families left the Garden Grove Way Station with a good outfit, prepared for their trek across the plains. Brigham Young's establishment of the farm was essential to the physical and economic recovery of the saints, which ultimately allowed them to reach their goal of settling in the Great Basin and prospering after their arrival. So, if any of you are interested in ongoing research on Garden Grove, I'm the director of the Center for Family History and Genealogy at BYU, and one of the projects that our students are working on is the Nauvoo Community Project, which Laura mentioned a minute ago. The URL is nauvoo.byu.edu. We're researching all the residents of Nauvoo that we can identify and following them to their deaths. We're posting all of the documents that we find online. So if you click on that search button that you see right there, middle right bottom, you can search for someone and it'll pull up a person's profile. Make sure that you notice at the top where it discusses whether it's traditional data or foundational research has been completed. The traditional data is literally family tradition. If it says foundational research, that says the students have worked on it and documents are attached. So if you notice the categories at the bottom expand, when you click on those buttons, what you'll see is all the information that we've gathered for those people, and for the documents that are attached, you can click on the links, it will open the original documents. So I want to just thank you for your attention at this late time of the last day of the conference, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to share with you my research and my love for Garden Grove. Thank you.